I'll give you a good intro first. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We also are going to welcome a live stream audience, and this will also be available as a recording on our library website later. So if you ever want to come back to it and re-listen or revisit something, it will be there. My name is Allison Foudy. I'm pleased to be a part of the Haley Public Library team. And behind the curtain is Denon Strope, who makes the magic happen, who's also running all the live stream for us. After the presentation, there'll be time for questions, but Anne has generously said if you have a burning question, jump in. But say it loudly, and we may repeat it so that our live stream people can also hear it. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Anne Jacobs. Dr. Jacobs is committed to decades of clinical, educational, and research experiences worldwide. She received a bachelor's degree in physical therapy in 1985 and a doctorate in neuroscience and physiology in 1995. She's taught neurology, neuroanatomy, human physiology. I think I got them all.
Neuroscience, lots.
Lots of it. Lots of neuro words. She's also been a clinical instructor at Pacific University, the University of California, San Francisco, and University of Indiana. Dr. Jacobs was one of the founders of the Peninsula Stroke Association, now the Pacific Stroke Association, where she served as the executive director for the first 3 years. She developed all of the programs and has spoken with hundreds of small groups about the warning signs of stroke and the potential of post-stroke rehabilitation. In addition, she has provided consultation to companies developing robotics, bionics, and orthotics for neurological rehabilitation. As a licensed physical therapist, Dr. Jacobs has worked in private hospitals, university hospitals, nursing homes, home care settings, her own private clinic, and most recently in a general outpatient rehab department. She continues to apply her knowledge toward neurological recovery in a vast array of patients and acts as a clinical instructor for physical therapy students. An early pioneer in stroke recovery and neuroplasticity, her goal has always been to educate and empower. This evening, she's going to discuss her book, which is also over there. We have it at the library. It's a great read. Highs, Lows, and Plateaus, A Path to Recovery from Stroke. Her book and the presentation tonight are designed to shed light on the incredible potential of recovery. Her ability to break down complex medical concepts into meaningful conversations will offer hope, insight, and practical strategies for anyone impacted by stroke. And I read it. I got it. So, you're right. And we do have it at the library. I'm turning my copy in tomorrow, so it will be available if you need it at the library, but again, she has books here as well. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anne Jacobs.
Just in case. Okay, that sounds great. Just press the button. Okay, so as I understand, I'll kind of chat for about 30 minutes or so, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. But if you came here with a specific question that it's hard to concentrate because you just have that question, just go ahead and raise a hand or ask the question, and then I'll repeat it. So thank you for that lovely introduction. Sometimes I wonder why I'm tired. But but I heard that and I'm like, gosh, I should be tired by now. So I've been doing this for a while, and my passion really is neuroplasticity. And so I'm just going to do kind of a brief introduction to neuroplasticity and to what's in the book. As mentioned, Allison said, I do have the book here for sale. If you buy it from me, it's $15 if you want to pay cash or check or use Zelle. Or you can, my husband made me a QR code. So I have a QR code, and you can order it through Amazon. Right now it's in a printed book and an e-book. But in the fall, it will be released on Audible as an Audible book, because for a lot of stroke survivors and their families, sitting down to read a book is not an option. So I think that'll be nice. If for any reason you can't afford the book and you would like to have the book, all you have to do is say, can I have a copy of your book? That's it, just ask me, and then you have a book. Also, to give credit to my husband, when I made these slides, I had a flat bar across the bottom, and he says, oh, you have to change that. So it's highs, lows, and plateaus. And what I want you to notice about the plateau is it's not quite as high as the high. And that's important, Because as much as I believe in the potential of neuroplasticity and the potential of recovery, it's really difficult to get back to where you were the day before a stroke. It's often difficult. So sometimes that's not achieved. So let me see, Denon told me to hit the button. So just briefly, and all of this is in the book, and I just pulled out a few things maybe for discussion. But what I find interesting is that the term neuroplasticity was actually introduced into the scientific literature in 1890. In 1890, it was introduced by William James, who proposed that the human nervous system in all of its elaborate design was capable of great change and plasticity based on how it was used. But that was disputed by the medical community, who said, no, 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 you know, the brain is fixed. We've got sections for hearing, we've got sections for vision, we have sections, and it stays that way. And it was that way until about, up until the 1970s, 1980s, so almost a century later. There was still this dogma in medicine that an injured brain is not capable of recovery. And I work with a lot of children now, and I often remind parents, when in the 1970s, if a child had Down syndrome, the recommendation was to institutionalize the child, because they would never learn to talk, they would never learn to have social skills, and so they needed to go to an institution. And we know that's not true now, right? So things changed. So in 1990, under H.W. Bush, it was declared the Decade of the Brain. And the Decade of Brain was with funding from the Dana Alliance for Neuroscience, which really gave a wealth of opportunity to study neuroscience. And I started school in 1990 to get my PhD in neuroscience. I was so excited. But at the time, you couldn't have a degree in neuroscience, because the powers that be were not convinced that neuroscience would stand alone as a profession of itself, as a degree of itself. So we had to get a second degree that was in a real science. So my real degree is in human physiology of the GI tract, and my other real degree is in neuroscience. So I have a dual PhD. And the reason is because they didn't think neuroscience would ever stand on its own. It's like, wow, right? Like, wow. Blows my mind. So in 2010, there was a lot of tools were being developed. There were robotic tools, bionic tools, tons and tons of tools coming out on the market, so I was consulting with those. And I got really excited about that, and in 2014, I published the first edition of this book, which I'm embarrassed to say has a ton of typos that I didn't notice. But when I went to do the second edition, I'm like, wow, there's a lot of typos. But in the first edition, I was so excited about all of these emerging tools in bionics and robotics and everything happening that I was convinced that that was the future. That was it, right? So that book kind of focused on use of those tools. Well, it hasn't been it, because they're very expensive, they're difficult to use, the science isn't really there, they're not getting to people, and there's a lot of barriers. So based on feedback from stroke survivors and their families, I did the second edition, which focuses more on super, super simple applications of what can I do myself to promote my recovery. So it kind of changed that direction. And so in 2020, of course, we're, 200, long time later. And that's kind of where we are now. And the research is just demonstrating over and over and over the potential for plasticity. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But this is where this is what I think my crux is every week, and I kid you not, every week, I see patients who have been told by a practitioner that they're probably not going to get any better. And we hear it over and over and over. We hear it with babies, we hear it with teenagers, we hear it with adults, and it breaks my heart. And the thing is that in 1952, there were a series of studies done with about 239 stroke survivors. And they took these 239 stroke survivors and they did conventional physical therapy. And they found that by 6 months, nobody was getting better. And they're like, well, we tried. We tried. But people weren't getting better. And so that led to papers in the 1950s, again in the early 2000s, and again 2011, stating that most motor recovery is achieved within 6 months post-stroke, and that without much improvement thereafter. And my thing is that if we look at the principles of plasticity, the first 6 months is when the brain is healing. And we really shouldn't be doing a lot of therapy in the first 6 months because that brain needs to heal. It's like having a wound on your arm and saying, well, that wound will heal if you just play enough tennis. Like, no, let the wound heal, and then we'll work on it. So those first 6 months really are about allowing the nervous system to heal and helping the family learn how to navigate this change that has occurred. After 6 months, and my favorite time is after a year, is when we really start to see the most plasticity and the most changes. But I feel like this body of research really became very self-limiting. It limited people's access, and I think we have personal stories where Medicare will pay for 12 visits. So if someone goes to therapy, they're exhausted after 2 visits. And the therapist says, no, we gotta push through. We got 10 more. But the reality is you could stop at 2, and in 3 or 4 months, you could come back and finish up the other 10 when you've had time for that neural healing. Also, I think that these types of quotes really reduce hope. They strip people of their hope, and they take away that hope of a continuum of recovery. And personally, it's ignorant. It's just like ignoring a lot of research that's showing that that's not how it works. And lastly, I think it does create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So for instance, in my book, we talk about the stereotypic pattern of stroke. And the stereotypic pattern, if anyone has ever seen someone who kind of walks with a stroke, is the arm is like this, the leg is like this, they have a cane, and they kind of walk. But the reality is that that pattern of stroke, or that pattern of walking, was determined by the tools which were introduced early in the rehabilitation. So if they're put in a rigid ankle brace, and they have no ankle motion, and they have no hip strength, they build a strut, right? And then, since they don't have any hip strength and ankles fixed in a strut, and then they're given a big-ass cane that shifts their weight way over here, that moves their center of gravity that way, so they have to walk like that. When in reality, that's not how the neuroplastic brain would have driven their walking pattern. So when we introduce changes in the right way, things continue. So this quote by Twitchell, and from 1952, is in all major medical textbooks. Every medical school, my daughter just went through medical school, she says, Mom, the quote was in our books. I'm like, I know. It's in every medical textbook. And it's just, And so this is my husband's favorite slide. To that I say, bunk. Because I'm not allowed to say worse words. So bunk, it's just not true. It's just not true. And so in the book, I'm really challenging not only the healthcare system to do things differently, but for we use the word stroke victim, but I am really pushing for stroke survivors to stop being victims. Stop it. Advocate for your rights, advocate for your rehab. And I say in the book, if you see a therapist twice and you don't like them, or you leave and you wonder what you're doing, or you leave and you feel worse than when you started, fire them and get a new therapist. And I know like up here, it's very limited because you're in a small town like we are, but now there are so many resources available to people through the internet, through long distance. I see people all over the country because we can do it through Zoom and through other ways. So we can do better. So when we look at those first 6 months, first off, there's a wide variance, and I'll kind of mention at the end, but of course, we have emergency treatment for stroke. People can get into the emergency department and they can be treated with TPA, and that can dissolve the clot, restore blood flow, and they can have a very good recovery in just a few days. They can have surgical procedures to tie off bleeding vessels. But the reality is less than 10% of people get to the hospital in time. Less than 10%. So that means that 90% of people who have a stroke are left with disability. And that is devastating. It's absolutely devastating. So when we look at those first 6 months, it's about healing. It's a reduction of inflammation, removal of debris and waste products, restoration of whatever cells are surviving, they start talking again. So when people see this recovery in the first 6 months, they're just seeing healing. It's a process of healing. And then I also, in the book, I talk a lot about how stroke survivors are not only the person that actually had the stroke, they're their friends, their family, their loved ones. They're all survivors because everybody has to kind of deal with managing the fallout. So kind of talk a lot about how rehabilitation is not just for the survivor, but for that network of people. So when we talk about neuroplasticity, because that's my thing, the definition is in orange.
Can you quickly go back to the slide that was just up there?
Uh-huh.
Thank you.
And if you want to, this is like straight out of one chapter of the book, but feel free to take notes. When we talk about neuroplasticity, there's a paper out. It's called Ben and His Plastic Brain. And it's about a young man that I worked with who had cerebral palsy. And his mother was told when he was a young age that Ben would never be able to live alone. Ben would never be able to drive a car. Ben would never be able to go to university. Ben would never. And they came to see me, and Ben was like 21 and was one of the most angry young men I'd ever met in my life. And, you know, it's like, why are you so angry? He says, because I'll never, ever be able to do anything. I'm going to live with my mom forever, you know, so he's mad. So we just started breaking it down. I said, well, what's something you want to be able to do? Well, he wants to button his own pants. Okay, you want to use the toilet alone so you can button your own pants. So we worked through that. Wants to learn how to cook, blah, 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 blah. Excuse me. So we continued to work, and I'm happy to say Ben moved into his own apartment. He graduated from university. He's married, and they have a baby. Because his mom refused to accept that dogma that Ben will never. He doesn't do it the way you and I would, but he does so independently. So who's to judge? So when we talk about neuroplasticity, the definition is the adaptive capacity of the central nervous system to form and reorganize synaptic connections, enabling it to modify not only its structure, but its organization. So that's a lot of words. But what I want to impress, and I'll show you on the next slide, is this ability is true in the young brain, the aging brain, and the injured brain. It just takes a lot longer in the injured brain. And this is an example of neuroplasticity. So this is actually a rat model. Back when I was doing my doctoral studies, one of my jobs was to take little frozen rat brains and slice them very, very thin. And then we would dye them, and we would look at the cells. And so we took rats, and I'm sorry, it's true. Some of the rats were given a small stroke so that they had difficulty moving one side of their body. Other rats were not. And then we put them in this environment where they had to work to get their food. Okay, they had to work to get their food. And what we found is in the rats who we kept enclosed, or that these are different researchers than our lab, but the rats that were kept enclosed, they didn't really learn. But the rats who had a motivation, their brain rewires. It's dependent upon the motivation of the animals. There were studies with primates who were given a stroke, and their arm, they were unable to move their arm. And what the researchers would do was they would put the food bowl close enough they could get it, but then they put it just a little further, and then just a little further, and then just a little further, until the primate was learning to extend its arm. And you see similar outcomes. So the cool thing is that in the human brain, dependent upon our exposure and our experience, the nervous system is capable of phenomenal rerouting and connections, okay? So in the book, I try to break this down super simple, and I use a diagram, something like this. My diagram is similar, not this one, but similar. It's cartoon. That's a real neuron sending out branches for new communication. And there's a whole chapter where I kind of talk about how this cortical reorganization is going to take place. And I tried to write it so that it was understandable without being too primary, and I think it's okay. And I think what's important to understand too, though, is if we push a recovering brain too hard too soon, what happens is the nervous system will prune off the branches instead of letting them grow. And I use the analogy of a rose bush in the winter. So if anyone ever cultivated roses, because I love roses, right? You cultivate roses, and in the winter, you cut them way back. And underneath the soil, that rose is pulling its rootlets into a tight little bulb to survive the freezing ground. But in the spring, when it's getting soil and water and nutrition and sunlight, its little roots go back out, and it starts to grow branches. And the same is true of recovering neurons. That's what they're going to do. So they're kind of like a rose bush. The other thing in the book I talk a lot about is kind of recognizing the stages of recovery. Because not everyone is going to be at what we call the same stage. And the stages of recovery are defined by a person, Siegfried Brunstrom, back in 1966, and they still hold today. That the recovering brain is first using low brain, then it's using high brain, it's changing. But you wouldn't treat a patient who's in stage 3 the same way you would treat a patient who's in, say, stage 5, because the brain is in a different place of recovery. So we have to do different things. And that's where I think we really fail people. The other thing I'm excited about is some of the neuropharmacological treatments are changing. So like people who have depression are different brains than people who have apathy. Apathy is that lack of caring. I don't care. I'm fine. It's a failure to recognize your own inabilities. That's very different than someone who's impulsive. And 20 years ago, every stroke survivor was treated with the same medication. Some would do better and some wouldn't. They say, well, we tried. And now there's a new array of medications that are designed for whatever that individual has. The other I'm excited about is transcranial magnetic stimulation is being used now. We're using it on the vagal nerve to wake up the brain and also cross brain. And it's using magnets because cells are bipolar. They have a positive charge and a negative charge. And you can excite cell populations and turn them back on by using a magnetic stimulation. CIT is constraint-induced therapy. That's kind of like the monkey. You tie the good arm and have them use the not-so-good arm for a little while. Neuroorthotics, robotics. So these are things that I try to discuss. The other is changing the environment. Just had a young guy. He's a little guy. And he lost his speech after a stroke. He's only 9. And he had a stroke and he lost his speech. And, you know, the family's like, oh, we never go anywhere because, you know, he can't talk and it's just frustrating for him. And I'm like, well, go. Where do you want to go? You know, and they're like, well, we really want to go to Disneyland and we want to do this. But it's frustrating for him. It's like, go. And they went, and when they came back, they're like, you can't believe it, how much more he's talking now. But the thing is, they changed the environment, because if all you talk about is, what do you want for breakfast? Did you have a nice day? Do you want to watch TV? Do you need the toilet? There's just not a whole lot of vocabulary opportunity. So when you change the environment, you're offering that vocabulary opportunity to really take off for learning. And his speech has continued to improve. And then the last point there I talked quite a bit about is reintroducing joy and success. Because the one thing is that as a stroke survivor, life ain't real joyful. Like, the days are kind of hard. And the family's constantly driving from one doctor's appointment to the next doctor's appointment, to this, to that. We have to do therapy, you have to. And it's like, for heaven's sakes, just stop. Go do something fun. But also measure successes instead of defeats. And I talk about a woman, CM, and she said that her life after her stroke was actually a better life because life was slower. People praised her for her improvement instead of criticizing her for what she couldn't do. They respected her fatigue. Like, there were things for her, she's like, wow, actually kind of like, she was in a high power executive, go kind of world where it was constant. And then after the stroke, everything slowed down, and she's like, wow, it kind of gave it new meaning. So kind of pulling from those little successes. Let's see here. This is a big one. I'm going to skip this one because it's kind of boring. Okay, this is a big one for me. Okay, so I just want you to look at that picture. Okay, is anyone, well, you're a physical therapist. Shh, you can't answer. Maybe you should, I don't know.
What's the question?
Is the gentleman prepared for standing?
Are they just
And
looking at his face?
it's his little moons over their faces. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, but
Does he look like he's ready to walk?
no. But again, we were taught the sooner you get them up, the quicker.
Well, you were taught wrong.
Yes, apparently.
You were taught wrong. You were taught wrong. I'm sorry, but it's wrong.
That's why you
And this is
to
what
learn.
I see. I was going to hospitals all around the country and speaking with the therapists and doing all of this. And this picture is one I would see everywhere I went.
Right, because you need to get
Because
them
you
up.
need to get them up quick. You need to get them moving soon. That's bunk. It's not true.
We're safe.
It's not safe for anybody. So the only way you can get this person up is to drag them up, put a brace on, give them a cane, hold them. I saw therapists sitting on stools, moving legs, and it's wrong. Before someone can do that, they first have to be able to sit independently. And they have to be able to sit independently with their eyes open and their eyes closed. They have to be able to sit independently while moving their head with their eyes open and their eyes closed. They have to be able to sit independently while reaching for something, either with both arms if they can, or with one arm if the other one can't quite yet. Once they've accomplished sitting, their nervous system, their brainstem pathways have calibrated vision, vestibular, which is our inner ear balance system, and the neck receptors. Those must be calibrated at the level of the brainstem before someone should ever be brought up to stand. But it goes against the hospital rehab dogma is oh, we got to get them moving. We've only got 12 visits. Get them going, get them going. And the thing is that we actually don't only have 12 visits. We have as many as we want. I see patients for 50 visits a year. I see them for 47 a year. I string them out for years. What determines the number of visits someone has is whether they're making progress or not. So if this person's goal is to be able to walk independently 20 feet, which is required by Medicare as a goal, he failed. But if his goal is to be able to sit on the edge of the bed with his eyes open and his head stationary for 1 minute, he passed. Yay, goal accomplished. I can set a new goal, and insurance will now continue therapy because I have demonstrated improvement. Once he can sit independently with good calibration of eyes, inner ear, and neck, then we move on to standing, and we do it all again. I'm willing to bet you can't stand with your eyes closed and move your head. You'll lose your balance. And because of the failure to calibrate that system. Once it's calibrated, then we always say the organism in research, but I guess it's humans, but then they can move. Without calibration, there is no movement. There's this thing I used to love, and I don't know who wrote it, and it says, we must move in order to perceive, but we must perceive in order to move. Right? Does that make sense? So therapy would have been much better spent teaching this gentleman midline orientation. If he has pusher syndrome, which is a syndrome where the good side actually pushes people away from the good side, so they're so far off balance. They should start lying down with repeated head movements over and over and over, eyes open, eyes closed, head movements, until the brain starts to organize those signals. Once they're organized and they're not dizzy when you do that, they sit up, they can sit. Once they can sit, they can stand.
It just reminds me of a toddler. Like, you would never hold a toddler like that and say, okay, honey, go for it.
Start walking.
Right? Look at the person's
Yeah.
head.
Yeah.
How could you let that person begin to move a foot?
They can't. He can't. He
And
can't.
especially with how much taller they are. Like,
Yeah, he can't. And she's holding him up.
Right.
Some S. And even like with toddlers, because I see a lot of babies right now, there was Berta Bobath who worked in the world of cerebral palsy, and her philosophy was more neurodevelopmental sequencing, like they should learn to roll, they should learn to crawl. I've never had an adult crawl. It hurts your knees, and you can't get up, and it's scary, and I've never done that. But in the book, I talk a lot about the neural progression as humans. And this, we mentioned earlier, humans are so totally cool because we're the only species who stand upright with reference to gravity on 2 tiny little feet and navigate our world. That's pretty cool. Bears can walk a few feet on 2 feet, but not very far, and it's not really functional. And in the book, I talk a lot about why I use a corner for standing balance, because if someone is in a corner and they close their eyes, they will fall backward. But they're safe, because they're in a corner. They hit the wall and they can touch the wall. They open their eyes and they're like, oh, that was scary. It's like, yeah, it was scary, do it again. And then they close their eyes. And then, that was scary, do it again. And then they do it again, and then pretty soon they're like, predicting it. The brain is predicting it. It's anticipating, it's learning, it's changing, it's going through plasticity. It's developing new connections, new brainstem. And that's the thing, is we have to have that brainstem in place before we can move forward. And there are some times when, I will work with a patient who I don't think is ready for walking, and I'll tell the family, for now, they need to use a wheelchair, but we'll work on transfers. And as they do their transfers and they're sitting, and I'll say, do this at home, let's take a month break. You work on these 2 skills at home, we're going to take a break of 1 month, and then come back. And we'll use our next 6 visits after that. And they come back, and they can sit, and they can transfer. But they're forbidden to walk. Forbidden. I'm like, if you even try to walk, I'm going to find out, you're going to be in trouble. Right? So then when they come back, then we start working on walking, because now they're ready. So, but you're right, we were taught, get them up, get them up, get them up, get them going, work harder, work harder, work harder, and the brain is going, I
maybe the impetus behind that was just feeding into the whole, like, input, sensory input, not expecting that he would walk, but that he's getting some weight on that leg.
But is it correct?
Well, I mean, this is a whole new way of thinking about it, of the brain
You
is
should
the aspect
you should read the book.
of letting the brain recover before it can actually process the information
Yeah.
you're feeding it.
Yeah. And I think one of the analogies I use also is my daughter played the violin. And when she was 8 years old, she had a coach who had a sign, a poster, that said, "Perfect practice makes perfect." And I just so disliked that sign. But we went because she was the best. Everybody said she was the best. And I had to be the best mom by taking my daughter to the best. And then one day she looked at my 8-year-old and she said, "You're a failure. You will never be a violinist. You don't practice perfectly." And we left. And we got a new violin coach. And my daughter is an extraordinary violinist because she started to enjoy playing the violin. And she even sits in, sometimes just to play. But the thing is that she needed to, if they had put her with an orchestra when she was 8, she would fail. And you can say, well, she needs to hear what it sounds like to play in an orchestra, and she needs to be pushed to sound like that, because if we don't give her that sensory input, how's she going to learn? Well, she starts in first grade, not in college, right? I mean, you're a teacher. We don't take a first grader and throw them in geometry and say, yeah, but if you're exposed to math, you'll be really, really good when you're older, right? I mean, it's the principles of learning and plasticity. So the other thing I want to mention is the word plateaus, and I talked about it a little bit. In healthcare, when someone plateaus, they typically are discharged. Is that your experience? It's a Medicare thing.
Unless you can prove they're making.
Right? Unless they're making improvement, Medicare's not going to pay, and all other insurances follow Medicare guidelines. And so people are discharged because they have plateaued. But the word plateau is very often used as a bad word. Oh, you've plateaued. It's like, oh, sorry, therapy's over because you plateaued. And people go home feeling a sense of defeat. They go home feeling a sense of loss because they're like, well, I plateaued. And it's like, well, a plateau's not always a bad thing. So sometimes a plateau is a place to rest, right? If you're climbing a big mountain and you hit that level spot, you are so happy. You're like, wow, this feels good. I can just stay here for a little while. And then you're ready to do the next big ascent. Sometimes a plateau is not really the fault of the patient who's trying to recover. It's because the therapist has run out of ideas. They're doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And so sometimes we have to say, well, what we're doing isn't getting the desired result, so let's try something new. Let's do something different. And often my patients will come up with the idea. They're like, we should try this. I'm like, okay, let's try that. I think it's ridiculous, but maybe it'll work, and then it helps. So sometimes it's about generating new ideas. Sometimes it's about generating new solutions or setting new goals. Sometimes the goals that we set are too high. So for instance, the orthopedic approach is often used, so someone's arm is like this, and then we're supposed to test strength, or functional measures or whatever, and it's like, well, there aren't any because he can't use his arm. So I change the goals and I say, can you bring your hand from here, can you bring it to your stomach? And they're like, oh, wow, I didn't know I could. And okay, so that's a goal. Yay, goal was met. Can you, if you lie on your back and hold it like this, can you straighten your elbow? Which they can, because the inner ear is taken out of, the vestibular system is no longer driving the arm. The arm is driven into flexion by the inner ear. So when someone lies down to exercise, the inner ear is no longer contributing to the arm, and they're able to move their arm. So then we start working on mapping their body. Can you touch your forehead? Can you touch your shoulder? Can you touch your hip while they're lying down? So we're changing the goal. Instead of saying, how much is your grip strength? Do you have 4 out of 5 strength in your elbow? Those don't have any meaning. It has no value. So the goal has no value. So there's no solution. So we change the solution. And the last thing is sometimes a change of tools. And I'm real big on ankle braces. I know I probably go on too much about ankle braces, but it's my passion. Because sometimes people are given these super rigid ankle braces, right? Because according to healthcare guidelines and reimbursement, you only get a new brace every 5 years. But, I haven't even worn the same pair of pants for 5 years, because sometimes you need new ones. So sometimes we have to introduce a new tool. So I'm always looking for ways to get equipment cheap, either by buying it or going to a foundation to ask for money, and so I can get people new braces, or get them new canes, or get them a different type of toilet seat, so that they're being challenged by something new. So that learning can continue. And actually, there's a lot of money out there. You just have to look for it. I'm going to skip this one because it's boring. This one, the potential of the human brain, I love this quote. So Pablo Casals was a cellist. At the age of 90 years old, he was approached by a student who said, "Master, why do you continue to practice?" And Casal replied, "Because I think I'm making progress." And I think that's a big part of what I believe. And in the book, I talk about a gentleman who I knew. I didn't work with him. He was a neighbor. But we had a little park. And he would walk probably the distance of there to there every day, and then back. And then he'd get in his wheelchair, and off he'd go. And I saw him every day. And then I found out what he was doing was timing himself. And when he was able to get to there at a certain time that he had set, he still had time left over, then he would go to there. And then he'd come back. And then he would go there. And then I watched him gradually be able to walk the entire perimeter of the park twice every morning. But he started by just practicing this little short thing until he met a goal. And then he did a little further till he met a goal. And then he did a little further till he met a goal. And I think sometimes we set a goal of walking, okay, well, your goal is to walk 60 feet. And then they walk 12, and you say, oh, shoot, you didn't make the goal. Well, maybe we should have changed the goal, right? Or changed the time, or changed something. So because I think I'm making progress. I'm just going to pause briefly because I'm going to, and again, I know I'm talking fast. Buy the book. It's in there. This is an author talk because I want you to buy my book. The last thing, and when I wrote the book, sometimes I think I should have put this last slide last. So it's last today. But I put it first in the book. It's early. Because I feel very passionate about it. And this is Stick Guy. And this is about recognizing the signs of stroke. Because, again, only 10%, less than 10% of people get to the hospital in time to receive emergency treatment for a stroke. And, you know, Stick Guy kind of tells the signs. Everybody has them everywhere. There's fast face, arm, speech time. There's be fast, balance, eyes, face, arm, speech time. There's Stick Guy, but basically difficulty talking or understanding words, weakness or loss of sensation on one side of the body, balance problems, vision problems, and a severe headache. And little Stick Guy was drawn by a man named Sam Frank, who was the first person treated at Stanford University with TPA, which is tissue plasminogen activase, and it dissolves clots so that it can't cause such severe brain injury. And I feel strongly about this, and for years I went all around the country lecturing on the signs of stroke, and it was kind of fun because I have thank you notes from people all over that said, because I had stick eye on the counter or on the fridge, or so I do think it's really important. And I even tell people, just tear that page out and stick it on the fridge, or put it on the bulletin board at the clubhouse, or whatever. But I really want to encourage people to know the signs, and I talk more about it, of course, and I just want to add is that in the last few years, there's been more and more research indicating that when women have a stroke, the signs of a stroke in women are a little bit different. So just like in men, when men have a heart attack, they have pain that radiates down the left arm, they have tightness in the left side of the chest, they have shortness of breath, and those are kind of heart attack signs. When women have heart attacks, they tend to have a band of pressure that goes around their torso. They tend to have jaw pain, and it can be on the right or the left. And so their symptoms are different. And it's the same with women. Often when women have a stroke, they have this severe headache, and they have a perception of a band around their chest, and they have the difficulty speaking. And I was just 2 weeks ago working with a young woman who presented to the emergency department, and the nurse told her, "You're not having a stroke because you're not having the signs of a stroke." But she was having a stroke, and fortunately it was recognized, but her symptoms were different. They weren't quite matching up. And I do think that so much of our healthcare has really focused on the outcome in men and not as much in women. And now we're seeing more looking at, how does it affect women? And we're seeing that there are subtle differences. So it's not in there, I wish it was, but it's something to be aware of, and there's lots of information online and so forth. So this is just in conclusion. If you want to reach me, feel free. I have a website. You can go there and you can email me from there. You can write down my email address. You can phone me anytime. I don't ever answer my telephone, but I always return messages. And if people text, as my friend here can testify, my phone is constantly, constantly. But that's okay. I don't mind. I turn it off at night. And then the book is there. And I do have it for sale. Again, if anyone has a financial situation where it's too costly, that's fine. Just let me know. Otherwise, we can do that. So I would like to open up for questions.
Let me grab the microphone so we can make sure anybody watching at home can hear. Does anybody have any questions?
So you noted that the stroke was an emergency. What good does it do to know that it's an emergency when the emergency medical people don't know that it's a stroke, and the emergency room people don't know that it's a stroke? So they're going to just leave you there because you don't have the face droop or the arm drooping. You have dizziness, and so that's not a stroke. So then no medication, nothing can happen. So what good does it do for you or your husband or your friend to know that it's an emergency when the medical people don't treat it as one?
So, Denon, was that loud enough, or should I repeat it? We're okay. So I think, that's a heartbreaking reality of healthcare, is too often people are left in emergency departments untreated. And this is where I really urge families to advocate for themselves and just to say, these are the signs. And, in the book, there's a story of a young boy who had a stroke. His mom knew he was having a stroke. They went to the emergency department, and the emergency nurse says, young children like this don't have strokes. And his mother was adamant, and she basically just threw a fit until a doctor came and agreed to do imaging and so forth. So I think, you know, and you and I mentioned this to you a little bit earlier, historically, we have used the word stroke victim, and I really want to change that dialogue. I think people should be fed up with being victims of a healthcare system that's not listening. And again, as women, we're learning now more and more that the signs of stroke are different in women and have been under-recognized for a very long time. And I'm still learning this. This is new. And I think advocating for oneself. The other is, I personally believe that as aging adults, we should know what services our local hospitals offer. So for instance, where I live, as long as we've lived there, we have known that if something happens, get off the hill, like fast, get off the hill. Well, just this year, our local hospital became a stroke-ready site. And so now they have specialists, they are ready to treat with TPA, they can get a helicopter down to a larger medical center, but that's just happened in the last year or two. And so I tell people, find out if your local hospital is a triage center, is it a stroke-ready center? If not, you know, and you recognize the signs, get off of here, or call, you know, do something. You can, I don't know if you guys have helicopter services, but I think for so long, like you said, you still see yourself as a stroke victim.
Yeah, I was victimized by the medical profession.
Yeah.
So I still consider myself a victim, all the way through, from start till now.
Till now.
I've been nothing but victimized. And I'm still mad about it.
Well, and I think you should be upset. And one of the things that I want to do is take that and promote change. Take that and promote learning. Take that and advocate for someone else, right? Does that make sense? Because you're not alone. You are not alone. Is there, let me see, is there anything anyone wants to add to that, or no? But we can talk more too. Is there another question?
I'll stand away from that. I actually do have a question.
She has questions.
I have questions.
Use the microphone, please.
Thank you very much. When you talked about the corner and the person standing in the corner, and I think in the book you talk about feedback versus feed forward.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit, and then about how it's important to allow the mistakes? Because I found that really fascinating, especially as not a stroke survivor, but my child, and I do things for her, and I realize I should let her make those mistakes.
Let her gently make mistakes.
Gently make mistakes, yes.
Yeah. So, Denon, we're good with that? Let me first talk about feedback versus feed forward. So, as we are learning, we use feedback. So let's take my daughter playing the violin. And we're, oh gosh, you know. And then she starts to realize at some point that she's hitting the wrong notes because she's getting feedback. She's hearing her mistake. She's seeing her mistake on her fingering patterns. And her brain starts to recognize that she is indeed making errors. And then the brain starts to predict. It starts to figure out that it's that third note of the fourth bar where she really screeches bad. So the brain starts to predict that error, and as she's approaching that error zone, the brain begins to do a little better. The same is true with a stroke survivor. Especially someone who has left-sided weakness, they will often make a lot of mistakes. So for instance, they may walk in a building, and as they're walking in the building, they bump their left side against the door. Well, what the family is going to do is the family has a good brain, so the family rushes over, takes their arm, and guides them safely through the door. And I say, don't do that. Don't do that. Let them hit the door. Don't let them get hurt. Stay close. Let them hit the door. Because they hit the door a few times with their wheelchair, with their body, whatever. They hit the door. And pretty soon, they start to predict dang it, every time I approach doors, I hurt my shoulder. And they start to predict, and then they're moving into feed forward. Feedback versus feed forward. Feed forward is the ability to predict. Feedback is reacting. You use a walking stick to help you when walking. You're using feedback, the stick, to allow your brain to anticipate forward. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And too often we just don't want to see people fail, so we are doing too much. And another little thing which really bothers me with the kids is, the mom gets them to the car, the mom puts them in the car, the mom puts on the seatbelt, the mom brings this around the mom's back, and then they're wondering why their back hurts. And, and I go out to the car and I'm like, okay, get in the car. And the moms are like, oh, they can't get in the car. I'm like, just let them get in the car. And they get in the car, and it's messy, and it's sloppy, and it's ugly, and we make sure they're safe, and it's not pretty. And then they get in, and I say, okay, put your seatbelt on. Oh, they don't know how to put their seatbelt on. Right, well, let them try. So they get, they do a little bit, and then you finish it for them, and the next time they do a little more, and the next time they do a little more, and then pretty soon you can just hop in the car and say, put your seatbelt on, Billy. So it's that ability to learn from errors. We have to have errors. You cannot be perfect. We have to have mistakes. And then you learn from those mistakes to anticipate what's next. Is that right?
I like that.
Okay. Uh-huh.
This has been really wonderful and informative. Thank you so
you.
very much. What is the current scientific thinking on stroke prevention?
I'm probably not as up to date as I should be on stroke prevention, to be honest, just because I've been kind of consumed with other things. But what we know is that our blood vessels have very, very smooth walls. The walls are beautifully smooth. And blood vessels have the ability to kind of have this contractile motion to move blood. As we go through life, we have things in our bloodstream that damage blood vessels. We eat foods, we drink chemicals, we smoke chemicals, whatever. Those little things that we're putting in our body kind of bang up against the wall of the blood vessel and cause little teeny tiny injuries. Little tiny injuries. And then our body's natural defense is to put down plaque. And plaque is what is like a Band-Aid. It puts a little seal over that nick on the artery wall, but it takes up a tiny bit of space. And then we keep doing what we're doing, and we keep getting more and more nicks, and we keep putting down more and more plaque. And then what happens is that blood vessel starts to get rigid because it's got Band-Aids stuck all over it. It's like duct tape. It's Band-Aids everywhere. So the blood vessel starts to get more rigid, and it's no longer responding to fluctuations in blood pressure. Okay? And because there's little Band-Aids everywhere, there are narrow sections. And now, as blood comes through a narrow section, it's under higher pressure, because the same volume has to go through a smaller area. And then we have cholesterol, which clings to the edge and starts to form little clots and little blood platelets and all kinds of things that adhere and start to form clots. So now we have a rigid blood vessel, we have high blood pressure, and we have stuff adhered that breaks off. And when it breaks off, it travels along until it hits a small vessel in the brain and blocks blood flow. So that's kind of the physiological. The other is injury, like if you're in an accident or something and you tear your carotid artery and it has a little flap, that can cause clots to form and cause a stroke. Sometimes heredity. Sometimes people just have a genetic predisposition to getting more sclerosis or hardening of the arteries and more clot formation. Sometimes there's hereditary conditions that cause little bleeds in the brain. That's also a stroke. It's just a hemorrhagic stroke. And then honestly, sometimes it's just really bad day. It's just bad luck. And often people who have TIAs, there's not always a reason why. But the clot originates from somewhere. Sometimes there's heart defects. Sometimes people have heart defects that are causing the blood to kind of form little eddy currents, like atrial fibrillation. And those little currents cause the blood to clot, and then the heart gets a nice strong contraction and pumps a bunch of little tiny clots out. And they travel till they hit the brain. So it's a pretty big window. Did you want to add something to that, sir?
I just have a thought about that is there's a lot of testing that can be done with MRIs and CAT scans and blood pressure and high cholesterol, etc. Is there a method of testing the whole body to detect these many things you just mentioned?
I think so, but I don't know enough to say anything about that. I think that's probably a good question for your physician, or I don't know. I know we tend to test systems versus the whole, but that might be the science of the future, right?
I found this book super encouraging because I, as a teacher, really believe in plasticity also. But I wanted to ask, why was it meaningful to you, Allison? If you don't mind saying.
Well, as a nursing school dropout, actually I'm a teacher as well, but I tried nursing school for just a little bit and found it extremely fascinating. And our clinicals were in nursing homes with several stroke patients. My family has a little bit of a history of stroke as well. What I found really interesting, though, about it wasn't necessarily like, I don't know if we could have prevented it, I don't know if we could have done anything like that, or these people could have done that, but the fact that they could recover. And so I thought that was really fascinating. And the book, I thought, outlined really nicely some of those steps. The feedback, feed forward, was one of the most interesting parts to me, because thinking about letting people fail nicely or fail gently, I like that, fail gently, which I think I feel like sometimes things are thrown at you, right? And you're told to get better faster and get it over with. We do the same thing as teachers sometimes. We're like, just get it already, right? And let's move on. And so I found that the idea of it doesn't have to be in 6 months. It can take years. I think that would be a really solidly interesting way to approach it, especially in nursing homes or, well, with anybody, really,
Yeah.
or with teaching, for that matter, right?
Well, and I think, too, one thing that I kind of wanted to get across also is that, when we're dealing with teaching someone tennis or skiing or some other activity, we tend to be very lenient, right? And we tend to, oh, you fell, that's okay, just get up again. And I'm a skier. I'm still learning how to ski. I've been skiing for a long time now, 56 years, 57 years I've been skiing. I'm still learning. I'm still challenging myself to do things a little bit differently. And when I get bored, I just do something stupid, like, oh, maybe I'll do this run with my eyes closed for the first little bit. Or because I'll look at it and I can do that, and then I just do it. Or maybe I could do this series of moguls on one leg. Like, that might be fun, right? So just kind of that continuum of learning. And I think that's the word continuum is what I really want to stress in stroke recovery, because as we were taught, you get them up, you get them moving, and you're done. Now, my patients who I see, I tell them, you have therapy every year. You have therapy approved by your health insurance every single year. So you need to be coming back every year. And sometimes they'll go to the doctor and they'll say, oh, I want to go back for therapy. And they'll say, well, why? You're not getting any better. And I tell them, and it's probably not the most ethical thing to say, but I say it anyhow. I say, tell them you have ankle pain. Right? Once you're in there, the therapist can start looking at your bracing, can start working on ankle strengthening and knee coordination and mechanics of the lower limb. So if they come in with a diagnosis of ankle pain and a history of stroke, I can continue therapy. If they say my shoulder is just, I just can't reach very high, my shoulder hurts, get a diagnosis of shoulder pain. We can work on your arm function. So sometimes, and I will say, and again, this is probably unethical, and anyone who's listening, sorry, but sometimes I tell people, and I have in the past, they go to the hospital, and much like you, they're not taken seriously. And I have had families who have gone in and said, oh my God, I think my husband's having a heart attack. Well, they get in right away. They don't stay in the waiting room. They're seen immediately. And then they're triaged, and they're like, oh, it's not a heart attack, they're having a stroke, right? But that word, heart attack, boom, they're in the door. So sometimes we have to do what we have to do, I know you have another question.
I have lots and lots of questions. I will ask just one more, though. And this is also from the book, your focus on multiple sensory systems.
Oh.
I found it very interesting, and I know you could talk about it for hours, but the focus on see it, hear it, feel it. And I was thinking about that in the context of a successful recovery.
Oh, thank you. I love that. Thank you. So that's kind of my mantra in therapy is you have to see it, hear it, feel it. We have to use multiple sensory systems. So for example, if someone, let's say that they are learning to walk, okay? I will set a metronome to match their walking speed. I will set a visual path for them to walk to, and I will often will put like a little vibration on their leg, or I'll tap them. I walk behind them, and I'm tapping their bottom, and and it's like see it, hear it, feel it. Because after a stroke, people lose sensory perception of their limbs, and so we have to use multiple sensory systems. And so it's about being creative. So, for instance, with a stroke patient, working on a leg press alone is not going to help them recover, because it's good for strengthening, but it's not helping with balance, it's not helping with sensory integration, it's not helping with navigational skills, it's not enough. So we combine senses. But the other is the work of Paul Bacchiarita, who I adored, is that our nervous systems, under plasticity, we have a redundancy of systems that we can use. So it kind of goes to feedback versus feed forward. And I'll give an example of someone with a vestibular disorder, so inner ear disorder. There are disorders where people lose vestibular function. And way back when, we did research on a device called the Brain Port, which is available in Canada. And it was an array of electrodes that was put on the tongue. And then people would stand in their corner, and this electrode array is on their tongues, but they have no inner ear function at all, okay? So they have to have a walker or a cane, to be upright. So you take that away, and they're in the corner, and then they close their eyes. Well, their eyes are open at first, but every time, if they tip backward, this array started to vibrate very forcefully on the back of the tongue. And then if they tipped rightward, the array would vibrate very forcefully on their right side. And then the left, vibrate. And so what they learned was to predict the vibration on the tongue and modify their balance based off of that feedback from the tongue. So because they didn't have inner ear function, the brain substituted the tongue as its feedback system. So it's pretty cool. And what happens is over time, the nervous system rewires and learns, and they can balance again. In amputee populations, when they're learning to walk with a prosthetic limb, they don't have any sensation from the prosthetic limb. So we'll put clickers on their shoe so that when they strike their heel, they hear the clicker. If they hit flat or they hit their toe, they don't hear the clicker. So then they know the position of their limb in space based off of sound. And they learn to walk using their prosthetic limb based off the sound of where their foot is. And every stroke survivor, when they're learning, they look at their feet. They need to know where their feet are. But they can't look down because that's not going to be useful. So we want their heads up, and we want to give sound feedback, vibration feedback, change their cane, change their brace, do everything using multiple sensory systems. And the beauty of our nervous system, too, is one sensory system can substitute for a missing system. We have that ability. For instance, if someone reads Braille, if someone is blind or low vision, they read Braille with their fingertips. The sensation coming from their fingers does not go to their parietal lobe, which is the sensory zone for the fingers. Because they're engaged in the act of reading, the sensory signal goes to their occipital lobe, which is the lobe designed for vision. So the hand sensation the brain learns to discriminate from when the person is reading, signal goes to the occipital lobe for vision. Person is making a cake, signal goes to the parietal lobe for control of the handle. Like, it's so cool. And think back to that little picture of all those little neurons. It's so cool. And that now, there's so much work in neuroprostheses right now. And they're making tremendous progress with speech using neuroprostheses, where they're recording from the brain and then stimulating the pathway for the vocal musculature. I mean, that's totally cool, right? So things are changing. Yeah. Are there any other questions? I think, if that's okay, I think this is a good place just to take a break. I am certainly happy to stay around if people have other questions. I'll also be over there if anyone would like to buy a book. As I mentioned, you can get them on any online bookseller like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Goodreads, Author House. They cost a little more because they're through an online bookseller. They come in printed version and they come in e-version, or you can get a copy from me. And you can use my new QR code. Okay, thank you guys very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.